Last week, I made a video talking about the books. And at the end of the video, I said, I am still going to continue to operate my theory videos under the idea that the books are in the game's timeline. That's just how it's going to be. But since a lot of you insist Secret of the Mimic can't work with Tales from the PizzaPlex being in the games, I'll explain why I think it absolutely can.
Take a seat.
Like, comment, and subscribe. Alright, so the common thing I'm seeing is the tapes in the game confirm Fiona was alive to take care of David, but the issue is that Fiona is said to have died in the Mimic while giving birth to David, so how can she be alive for David to have multiple birthdays? Well, I want to call attention to the moon portion of the game where we find a note that says, Memory error, detail report. We were expecting, there were complications, consciousness was lost for an undetermined time. Once I woke, we were all together and happy, a family, but something was different. I felt wrong somehow. Was I me? I would never sleep again. Corrupted file suspected, please advise. This would imply there were complications at birth and Fiona lost consciousness. That is a direct reference to how Fiona dies in Tales from the PizzaPlex. So what's the deal there? I have only seen 3 explanations so far trying to explain this note, and honestly, none of them have been that great. The first one I have seen, which I would say is the best of them, is when Edwin put M2's consciousness into the M1 endo, and he put M1 into the Fiona machine. That's what caused Fiona to feel weird and not know if she's her. Except if the idea is that Fiona wrote this while in the machine, I'm sorry if it sounds nitpicky, but how would she write that note? The machine she is in doesn't have arms, it can't move. Again, I know that probably sounds nitpicky, but I do think it's an issue with that interpretation. The next interpretation I've seen is that it means M1 had a dream, which was basically the events of the Mimic from Tales. This whole idea suggests M1 would dream every other Tales story, and it goes into the theory that Tales from the PizzaPlex and Fazbear Frights as well are just like in-universe books made by Fazbear Entertainment, which I'm sorry, but that idea has nothing backing it up in the first place. It honestly, to me, comes off as a way to acknowledge the books without having to believe everything they tell us, so that way you can just choose what you want to take from them. The only other interpretation I have seen is that, oh, this is just scrapped content that Steelwolf forgot to take out of the game. No, the note was not scrapped, it is quite literally in the game. When you can't explain something, you can't just make the excuse of, what if it was meant to be scrapped, but the devs forgot? That goes into what if territory, where you can just make up what you want. I could use the argument and say, what if the tapes with Fiona talking in them were scrap content and they forgot to take those out? Obviously, I'm not going to suggest that, but that is pretty much the same logic as saying the note was meant to be scrapped. So what do I think the note is? Well, notice how it says memory error and suspected file corrupted. Also, since it's referencing how Fiona dies in Tales, that makes me believe that it was M1 who wrote that note. Here's some clips from my other video. I also want to point out similarities between Edwin and Henry. In the Mimic, when Edwin is destroying his creation, the way it is written is very, very similar to the way Henry creating the 4th Charlie bot is written. Quote where Henry builds the Charlie bot. His despair turned to rage. He seethed as he soldered her skeleton together, pouring his anger into the forge where he shaped her very bones. Now here's a quote from when Edwin destroys the Mimic. Edwin had been lost in a void of despair, and now his despair had turned to rage. He could almost feel his murderous thoughts pouring through his muscles and transfusing through the metal into Mimic systems. So under this idea, Edwin would have attempted to bring back Fiona. Obviously, if Fiona is just the Mimic, she can't give birth, but Edwin still needed her to at least have memories of giving birth to David, so he recreates those and puts them in the Fiona bot. So Fiona was given the memories of when the real one died in childbirth. Now, we have both a Robo-Fiona and a Robo-David, so I believe Edwin recreated his family, and I actually have even more evidence for that than I did in my previous video. It comes from two Tales from the PizzaPlex stories, Help Wanted and Dittophobia. In Help Wanted, Fazbear Entertainment hired a man named Steve Snodgrass to make indie games for them based on actual events. While making the indie games, Steve was given a family, a wife, a son, and a daughter, who Steve believed to be real, but little did he know that none of them were actual people. They were all robots. Steve only believed them to be real because the house was filled up with sound illusion discs. I think it's possible the same thing is happening with Edwin's family. Something that has been bothering me is I couldn't figure out who in the games made the illusion discs. At first, I suspected Henry, because he made them in the novel trilogy. But in the novels, Henry only makes them to replace his dead daughter, also making a robot version of her. But we know Henry doesn't do this in the games because in the novels, making the Charlie bots is what leads to him committing suicide much earlier in the timeline than he does in the games. So if he didn't make the Charlie robots, I find it unlikely he made the discs. However, in Secret of the Mimic, we find out that Edwin's home is actually the FNAF 4 house, that David's room is the same one we play in during FNAF 4, meaning sometime after Secret of the Mimic, Afton would take that home for himself and throw his youngest son inside of that room and start running his gas experiments. Interesting that Edwin owns the home that is shown to be full of illusion gas. Also interesting that throughout that home, we see hoses all over the place, similar to what is described in Dittophobia, showing the quote on screen. These hoses in Dittophobia run the gas, so why is Edwin having fear gas get pumped all throughout his house? Unless his house is full of illusion. Another thing I find interesting is to notice how in these tapes there is not a single time where the camera hands over to Fiona or David. I wonder why that is. Well, in the books, whenever the adult Charlie was caught on camera, the image would just blur because the illusion discs were meant to send signals that overwhelm your brain. However, that does not work on a regular camera. Neither does gas. Gas actually would probably have no effect on a camera. So that would explain why Edwin never pans over to his wife or son. He doesn't want to show himself the truth. There are, however, portraits of Fiona and David where they look human. I do think that's possible because in Help Wanted, Fazbear Entertainment managed to create realistic-looking photos of Steve with his wife and kids, even though nothing in those photos ever actually happened. So this theory would be that in the games, Edwin is the one to create both the hallucinogenic gas and the illusion discs. The gas is for when Edwin is home regularly with his fake wife and kid, and the discs would be for whenever Fiona hangs out in public with other people. Since we know other people meet Fiona and David, Fiona hires a babysitter for David multiple times, she helps the Fall Fest crew, Edwin tries throwing David a surprise party. Fiona even helps design the characters for Fazbear Entertainment. The discs would be used for whenever Fiona and David go out in public and talk with other people. That way Edwin can fool more people than just himself. As we know, eventually Fiona goes to Fall Fest and the fire happens, but I find Edwin's reaction to be interesting.
Oh, why did you go? You weren't even supposed to be there. You were supposed to be here with me and David. Oh, how am I supposed to tell David that his mother is gone?
He sounds more annoyed than upset that his wife just died. Perhaps it's because he knows he could just build another one. Also, I find it odd that Edwin says she wasn't supposed to be there, she was supposed to be with him and David. Why is she supposed to be with Edwin and David? I think maybe it's because that was her intended purpose when Edwin programmed her. Edwin rebuilds M1, but the issue is people believe that Fiona died in the fire already. so that would explain why M1 is a hidden creation this time around. However, it seems at first, instead of making the mimic Fiona, Edwin tries repeating the events of the mimic story from Tales. Here's some clips from my other video to explain it. So he thinks back to when he had his actual son. The last time David would love playing with the mimic, so Edwin tries that. But this time he has wearing costumes in mind for what the mimic does. He wants the mimic to play with David in costumes this time around. However, something goes wrong. He introduces David to the new mimic, and it's not like how the real David reacted.
David, I want to introduce you to someone. This is M1.
Why does it look like that?
Look like what?
It's scary.
The real David loved the mimic instantly. The current one doesn't. He's scared of it. This is probably when it really sinks in for Edwin that he didn't get his family back after all. This, I believe, leads to Edwin letting it sink in even more that M2 David is not his real son, so he destroys M2. Notice how the game never gives us an explanation for how David dies. We have Fiona's death explained in the game, Edwin building M1, but then it just jumps to Edwin destroying M2 and M1 tries to get him to repair it. Holy time skip, where's the stuff about David's death? Unless maybe David was always M2 and this tape is meant to show us David's death.
Stop! You're not him. You're not! Stop sounding like him!
Edwin kills him out of anger because he isn't the real David. Edwin doesn't seem to have much luck repairing M2. He even acknowledges that it isn't working like it did the first time.
Someone told them about M2. Well, they can't have it. Every copy has failed. I don't even know why it worked the first time. But it did.
Here's why I think recreating David and Fiona worked the first time for Edwin, but not the second. The way Henry was even able to bring Charlie to life was because in his sadness, he had poured a piece of himself into Charlotte's old Ella doll. It was part of his soul being in that Ella doll that ever gave life to Charlie in the first place. As for David, in the mimic, Edwin cries into the tiger plush, quote, "Now he could remember squeezing Tiger, crying so hard that his tears soaked Tiger's fur," end quote. Now here's a quote from the fourth closet. "He cried over that cheap store-bought rag doll for 2 months. He cried into it, he bled into it, he poured his grief over it," end quote. If the first version of M2, David was given the tiger plush, freshly cried into, then that would be how that David managed to come to life in the way Edwin wanted, because part of Edwin's soul bled into the tiger plush. However, future attempts fail because Edwin is not aware of why M2 ever worked the first time. Edwin poured his agony and tears into M2 and M1, but if he's not doing that the second time, that would explain why they are less successful. Edwin makes multiple attempts to fix M2, and he settles with putting M2's consciousness into M1, and putting M1's consciousness into the Fiona machine. This obviously doesn't work out, because once M2 has a functioning body, he attacks Edwin, like Edwin did to him. Now M2 only knows violence. This also would explain Edwin being traumatized in The Storyteller, since in that story, Edwin freaks out a whole bunch when he sees Mimic 1 being used to program the Storyteller. Some people also pointed out in my comments that Secret of the Mimic seems to have its own Storyteller, which is true. We see that during the Foxy Puppet Show. That whole storyline was generated by AI. But guess what? When Edwin hears the suggestion for the Storyteller in the PizzaPlex, it says Edwin is having a sense of deja vu. He also gets overly angry at the idea of firing employees and using AI to write new stories instead. Even just randomly screams at them, "You are all idiots!" Perhaps Edwin is projecting. Maybe this hits a little too close to home, and Edwin is being reminded of mistakes from his past. The last thing to really acknowledge is Edwin's dad owns Murray's Costume Manor. That's Edwin's dad's place, while Edwin's company is actually called Murray Co. We see this in 5 Laps at Freddy's when there is a giant advertisement for Hug, a robotic vacuum unit, which according to the books would be Edwin's first creation that he sells until bad reviews and complaints come in, and Edwin's business goes down the toilet. Which I think explains why when Edwin's dad dies and gives the costume manor to Edwin, Edwin doesn't think he is capable of running a company.
He's gone. He's gone, and now everyone is asking me what to do? And I don't know anything. I can't run a company. I'm not ready. I can't fill his shoes. He knew it. Everyone knew it. The company is going to collapse, and they're all going to hate me.
So there, this is everything I believe when specifically talking about the book debate. Like I said in my previous video, I am not going to make any other videos addressing the continuity debate unless something actually huge comes up. I am still going to make a lot of Secret of the Mimic videos, however, because there is quite a bit in this game for me to yap about. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next week.